Jordan Peterson just said the unspoken part out loud. What you're about to watch is a masterclass on what free speech truly means, and just how far a society that used to champion it has really gone. And not just that, I think it's the most scathing charge against a modern mainstream media that arguably has forgotten the tenet of free speech at its own peril. Just take a look at this.
You have the right to speak freely so that the truth can be investigated. And the truth needs to be investigated because the truth is very complicated. The truth isn't a set of facts. The truth is an approach to discussion. Mm-hmm. That's what Joe Rogan's so good at. That's why he's so popular. It's not because Joe knows the truth. It's because he acts out the truth in his speech and his actions. So the CNN people came after Joe Rogan. One of them said, essentially, man, what's going on here? We've got this whole bureau's devoted to fact checking and the truth and all these experts hired. And why the hell aren't people listening to us when they listen to Joe Rogan and he's just winging it? And I thought, just winging it, eh? You try just winging it in front of 11 million people for 5 years and see if you're still standing, buddy. Well, first of all, why aren't you doing it if it's so damn easy? And second, isn't it something that with all your resources, you can only garner like 1/10 of the audience of one man who has like zero production and all he does is have honest conversations. You know, Joe stumbles and he knows that and admits it. And sometimes he gets too, buttoned down on a given point. But fundamentally, he's just trying to do what we're doing here. Hey, keep at it, guys. Every time you attack him, 1 million more subscribers for Joe. I don't think he can be canceled. In fact, I think all the attempts to cancel him only redound to his credit and increase the rapidity with which he's destroying the entire legacy media.
You know, the thing about our culture that I think most of us on the inside don't see, the values of free speech that we champion are a beacon for the rest of the world, and there would be no greater shame than for us to lose it ourselves. And there's one core reason for that, which I believe exists. We've misconstrued free speech as simply a virtue and not the mechanism that it really is. In other words, you don't need to know the truth in order to have the right to speak. You need to have the right to speak so you can get closer to the truth through dialogue. The critical conflation between those two things in the womb from which things like modern cancel culture and political correctness are born, and there's hardly a bigger catalyst for that in modern society than mainstream media. They have become so used to the crafted, scripted, and commodified speech in the form of news bulletins and talk shows that they've forgotten what free-flowing debate really looks like. If you're wondering where their friction with a character like Joe Rogan comes from, that's where. Joe's easily on par with, if not exceeding, the viewership of industry giants like Sean Hannity, Anderson Cooper, and Tucker Carlson, formerly on Fox News. Put yourself in the shoes of a big news media executive and see where the frustration's coming from. It's seeing someone stand outside, go against all conventional media wisdom, and yet almost become too big to cancel. In fact, we already see evidence of that a couple years ago when a group of musicians started threatening Spotify to delist their music from the platform if it hosted Joe Rogan. Not only did Spotify refuse to budge, but Joe Rogan literally got an alternative offer for $100 million from the CEO of Rumble, Chris Pavlovsky. For anyone with wisdom, that should have told them that there's a vacuum in public conscience that Joe's filling up and cannot simply be wiped away. It seems like there's yet an absence of that wisdom in the high-level media execs because what Joe Rogan is really doing is being intellectually relatable. He sits down for up to 4 hours on occasion, sitting and listening to people much smarter than him and asking every smart or dumb question that comes to mind. That means the conversation flows like a river to where it naturally wants to go, and the millions of his listeners are taken along for the ride. It's that freedom and spontaneity that results from genuine free speech, an understanding of which is still largely missing from mainstream media.
The only real rationale for opposing free speech, apart from ignorance, which is that you don't know that free speech isn't just another right and you don't know it's indistinguishable from thought, is the conclusion that you've already figured it all out.
Or you're trying to hide something.
Well, that's the other possibility. But those two things go hand in hand very frequently, is that it's very often that people who are trying to hide something justify that to themselves with a kind of totalitarian certainty about their beliefs. they double down on them to hide their own moral iniquities. You have to believe that people like Rogan shouldn't be allowed to just have a discussion with whoever they want and wing it. And you think that because you think you already know. You want to find out how you're wrong. You should talk to people who don't agree with you. Now, maybe 90% of what they say is not worth attending to, could easily be. Probably the same goes for you. But 10% might be just what saves you in the next crisis.
There's a quote by Jordan Peterson that has stuck with me ever since. Quote, "Evil is the force that believes its knowledge is complete. That's because it captures perfectly the one thing that is needed for true free speech, which is intellectual humility. You have to be willing to admit that you ultimately don't know, and that there's always something you have to gain if you're willing to listen. You know what happens when people are too sure of what they believe? They turn into totalitarian monsters because everyone else automatically becomes wrong, evil, and the enemy. The thing about truth is that it's a pursuit and a practice rather than a destination. It's a journey that almost never ends because there's always one more thing you're wrong about that you need to learn. And what about anyone that thinks they've reached the destination and no longer need dialogue and speech? They stagnate, become outdated, and fall by the wayside as the rest of the world moves on. I think on a larger societal level, that's what we're doing by obstructing the practice of free speech with obstacles like offense, political correctness, and the threat of cancellation against anyone that speaks out of line. But for free speech to function, there's also an internal mechanism that needs to exist, which is the freedom for ideas to move freely among different rungs of society.
It's like, yeah, but where does the rubber hit the road? Well, the truckers know that because they're down there moving goods to people. They're doing the actual work in the most fine-grained manner. Now, they might have a problem with high-order articulation. They don't have trouble with enunciating blunt truths. While the intellectual chattering class is criticizing the truckers, there's a divorce between the intellectualized framework, ethical framework, and that practical reality that the working class people represent. Yeah. And I mean, your observation that the truckers and the Joe Rogans are serving as redemptive agents is a reflection of the idea of the brilliance of individual sovereignty, the notion of individual sovereignty as the basis for political stability. It's like, well, who should you consult? Well, not just the people with the ideas, the people who drive the trucks. Well, why? Because they're navigating the roads. They're delivering the goods in the real sense. Their life is real. It's not abstracted to the point where the abstractions themselves become a problem. To the truckers, keep your heads, gents. Don't take the bait. Don't let your frustration translate itself into violence. Be careful, be careful, be careful. There's a lot resting on what you do, right. Every single one of you. Eyes open, like ethical stance forward, caution, bravery, truth, care. If you're on the side of the right and the good and the true, it will prevail if you can tolerate the intermediary heat.
Do you start to see free speech in the sense almost start to be conceptualized as a bottom-up approach? Like the roots of a tree getting its nutrients from the ground, ideas flow between societal hierarchies from the working class to the governing and thinking class. And here's what this prevents from happening. It stops ideas from being stagnated and sterile in the minds of thinkers and theorizers while also preventing the practical knowledge of the working class from being stuck in their own class. That's exactly what the Truckers' Freedom Convoy in Canada represented, whether you agree with it or not. From the very gears of society that keep it functioning, people rose up and communicated their grievances over the mandates back in 2022. It's a different matter that Justin Trudeau's premiership hardly even respected that articulation from the bottom of the speech hierarchy, but it's an interesting case study for what to look out for in our own society. And all you need to do is look at cultures where this free movement of ideas and free speech is constructed in order to realize how dangerous that is. Take a country like China or North Korea, where each citizen is practically a vessel or a client of the state, and you realize how suffocating that would be to live in. But you know what they've done? They've really just traded the pain and offense of free speech for the certainty and stagnation of their own ideas. I think we're smart enough to realize that it's not the price we're willing to pay, because that's not the kind of society we want to be. And establishing that means understanding what the price is up front, which is growing a thicker skin, admitting our own ignorance, and being willing to hear out opinions, even if we disagree with them.